I've talked about the various hurdles and disadvantages that DOS gaming has to overcome in the present day, so instead have a positive video about the inherent qualities that this wonderful platform has that modern games just can't compete with. The size. Almost every DOS game ever made, commercial or otherwise, can collectively fit into less than a terabyte of data. This is because the storage mediums had a much smaller capacity back in the day, so any game that took up more than 100 megabytes of space was seen as this vast luxury title, with most of the data from these big games read from the burgeoning optical media format that they were delivered in because the hard drives simply weren't big enough to store everything. These days, a game that takes up less than 100 megabytes is seen as the exception to the rule, with uncompressed game sizes ballooning in recent years to over 100 gigabytes a title. So if it's a simple case of math, 100 games on a drive isn't as good as 7,000 games, right? Okay, so it doesn't always work that way, but there are other reasons too, bear with me. The system requirements. A lot of fun has been had from various hardware enthusiasts getting Doom to run on anything from a tractor to a calculator to a fridge, but they often fail to mention that Doom was originally a DOS game. And while the number of systems that DOS gaming in general can operate on isn't quite as large, the requirements are still minuscule by today's standards. Whether it's a beat-up old netbook with an Atom processor, or a dusty yellowing box of a system, or even the latest liquid-cooled LED magnet with more cores than you can shake a stick at, thanks to emulation, DOS games can run on anything, which is something that can't be said about the poorly optimized messes that are being released these days. So instead of beating your processor and graphics card half to death with resource-heavy slogfests, give your computer a break that it deserves and let it emulate something simple from the past. Unless you're using it to heat the house, of course. Tried and trusted. These days, everyone rides the hype train, and consensus is formed through a mixture of reviews and streams and YouTubers, and it's all very fishy, and games can go from good to bad in the blink of a forced update. I keep dipping my toe in the water with modern games that have received an overwhelmingly positive reception, only to find myself staring at the screen and muttering, "That's it?" Back in the 90s, if you were a computer games journalist and you lied about how good games were in order to hype them up, you'd be found out in short order and thrown out of the building for compromising the integrity of a publication. Now, the positive bias for old games still exists in the form of nostalgia, but you can look up contemporary reviews from the 90s at a touch of a button, and consult any number of the greatest DOS games lists, even by genre, and the same names will keep cropping up with good reason. Nobody is hyping up Warcraft 2 these days. They're just playing it and enjoying it and telling you that you're missing out if you haven't experienced it. The same goes for hundreds of other great games. So unlike the modern marketplace, you'll never be misled and you'll never come across an absolute stinker, because there's no profit to be made in trying to sell a turkey because it has already been found out to gobble. Everything rough has been retrospectively inspected and rejected from release day to present day. More variety. It might sound strange considering the enormous amount of games available to play in the modern age, but there was actually more variety of play in DOS gaming than any other system ever made. Back in the transitory era, from microcomputer to personal computer, everything was in a state of flux. Developers were still figuring out how to do things, and this means that you're going to come across more control schemes, more interfaces, and more experiments by going back to DOS gaming than you ever would in modern gaming. Generic game is a first-person roguelike crafting sandbox that blah blah blah. We know what that is, what that entails, and the gameplay elements that it will present to its audience, because all these things have been figured out and standardized in the ensuing years, and the games that are more difficult to pigeonhole in terms of both genre and mechanics are the ones that are more difficult to sell. With DOS gaming, you have an enormous number of experiments before the rules for what constitutes the way things should be done were laid down, and unlike with consoles, you had a huge array of keyboard combinations options to pick from as a developer. It was a gaming frontier, a brave new world that creative minds got to explore, and nothing like it has been seen since. At least not until we all get placed into virtual reality pods because the present day has become intolerable to live in, all patched up. When you play a DOS game, it's highly unlikely that it will get an update. There are notable exceptions, but for the most part, these games are as definitive and up-to-date and ready to go as they'll ever be. As I've mentioned before and in the past, with most modern gamers tied into a unifying launcher with baked-in DRM and not actually owning the games they play, they also leave themselves at risk to the whims of the dreaded developer updates. Suddenly the title you enjoyed has got an update that means you can't play it on your system anymore, or it's changed a fundamental gameplay mechanic so that it's less effective. Or there's a new launcher that means you have to click twice instead of once to play the damn game. Just let me play the game, I don't care about your breaking company news. With DOS, there's no chance of this. You just play your game and enjoy it, and you're in control of how you play it. Speaking of which, you choose the version. In my Importance of Ports video, I stressed that there are multiple versions of classic game releases, and some of them are better than others. Maybe you want to play the PC Junior version of a game because it's slightly better in the graphics and sound department. Maybe the PC version wasn't the definitive one at all and you should just be emulating a Sega Genesis instead. While not exclusively a thing that DOS does, this highlights a major difference between most modern games and the emulation scene we have today. Unless your game is open to community modification, it's a walled garden with a singular artistic vision. And if players don't particularly like an element of that, then tough luck. With many DOS games, so many things can be tinkered and changed and improved upon, and the more popular the game, the more likely that is to be the case. Dune 2 is pretty much the perfect example. The soundtrack can be played through AdLib, Sound Blaster, MT32, Sound Canvas, Tandy, or even PC Speaker if you want. If you're crazy, you could play the DOS version, the Acorn version, the Amiga version, or even the controller-friendly Genesis version if you want. And don't get me started on the various scaling and rendering methods for the graphics. Or if you don't fancy emulation, there's loads of source ports, each with their respective visions of how they think the game should be played in modern day. There's even a demake available for the fantasy console Pico 8. With a dizzying array of options, you could argue there's too much choice, but having the option is always better than not having it if you ask me, and with retro gaming in general, you have a staggering variety to appreciate, so you can play things how you want to. You know, like reducing the Dune soundtrack to NES music with sound fonts. Okay, maybe not. They respect the player's intelligence. It's not talked about often these days, but I make a habit of doing so. The early era of computing was an era of privilege and one of education. The majority of people using computers in those days had a certain degree of intelligence or wealth in order to gain access to these newfangled devices, especially in the comfort of their own homes. And the devices were treated with a certain degree of reverence, rather than the throwaway machines of today that everyone owns. It's not a popular sentiment that this era of computing was superior, but that doesn't change that it was. And as the years went by, the targeted demographic of gaming in general shifted as the general public lumbered into the scene, and gaming subsequently became a huge marketplace. A games company that is targeting a group that is mostly filled with bright people in higher education, scientists, lecturers, and business folk is going to take a markedly different approach to design and implementation than one that targets Joe Blogs. There was an unspoken expectation that if a player was struggling to understand a concept, they would consult a manual, or that they'd at least have perused it before even beginning the game to understand the basics. With a move away from game manuals and a change in audience, even the most complex games are now littered with tooltips, tutorials, and hand-holding that opens up their accessibility, but also curtails that feeling of danger and potential punishment. Likewise, there's less sense of reward from doing something because the game told you to than figuring it out yourself and the game acknowledging and rewarding your ingenuity. A great place to see this in action is in popular games that have received a spiritual successor. One that many of my subscribers have talked about in the past is XCOM. In the new XCOM, developed by Firaxis, you're given a glitzy, high-profile series of cutscenes and voiceovers explaining each and every concept of your base to you. and an almost on-the-rails first mission. Everything needed to ease the new player in, and a feature that has been welcomed by the modern gaming scene. Why? Because the original XCOM was quite happy to mercilessly kill you at any given opportunity, and featured a layout that was once compared to the controls of a nuclear sub in terms of complexity. But behind this interface and masochistic pleasure in hurting the less strategically savvy player lies a game that's actually more complex than its spiritual successor in terms of gameplay, to the point where the latter was modified by fans to fall more in line with the original. The older XCOM expects the player to be both intelligent and strategically minded. It expects you to read the manual, understand the concepts, and it isn't afraid of hurling you into terrible scenarios, but the dizzying highs of strategic brinksmanship that can be achieved after understanding all of this are much greater than any modern equivalent. And it's a thing that can only come about through respecting both player agency and intelligence. Until you throw the keyboard into the monitor because of a damn sectoid you didn't see killing your best soldier. The games were better. They say leave the best till last, so let's come out and say it. The 80s and 90s were the high watermark for games development, and the system with the most games from that era developed for it was DOS. Almost everything since has been a slow and steady decline that has been carefully hidden by increased ease of use and graphical improvements. Modern gaming journalists will tell you the opposite, because it's their job to do that and get you excited and get you to buy the next new thing. And usually they'll throw in an outstanding old classic into their best of lists as lip service to a bygone era. The problem with that is the very best DOS games were either never replaced or never improved upon. And when they were, it was usually by a Windows game also developed in the 90s, or at the very latest in the early 2000s. It's almost to the point where I could go through each genre and highlight a game that's either arguably or uncontestedly the best of the bunch, despite being developed 20 to 40 years ago. An act of sheer genius that has left everything since just trudging in its shadow. The Salieri to their Mozart or the Edison to their Da Vinci. There's a lot of fun modern games, but maybe the games developed in that golden era preceding them are greater than a once-in-a-generation achievement. Perhaps that fertile ground of the 80s and 90s as a backdrop was the only thing that could inspire it, and not having that intangible something from that time in the present day prevents the creatives of now from achieving the same heights, despite much less barriers to entry. Whatever the reason, so many of my favourite games have never been surpassed, and that's the final and most important reason why DOS gaming is better than anything that comes out today. What's that? Oh yeah, it costs less. Oh, I forgot about that one. And if you like me randomly talking into a microphone about old games and DOS and stuff, boy have I got a channel for you! Hundreds and hundreds of videos of me doing just that. Feel free to take a look, and if you like what you see, you can subscribe. Until next time.